when you do a contract review or involved in contracts, there are a number of things to look at. One is, and some of these may seem silly, but these issues come up all the time. What is the term of the contract? And that may be a difficult answer because the term can have automatic renewals. We'll see that in a minute. Or there could be periods of time if there is certain performance, the contract may end sooner. So if you look at a contract and it says, the first page it says the term is a year, that may not be the whole story. There may be another provision in there that talks about automatic renewals. Who are the parties to the contracts? And the parties may not just be the people that are listed on the front page. There may be guarantors at certain sections, and you have to understand that there are other third parties that may be not listed as a party on the top page, but maybe signatories to particular sections or may be listed within the contract itself. There may be certain UCC filings, to secure a security interest and what the renewals are. The contract also will have operative provisions, what is expected of each party, and it's going to have boilerplate. And a lot of people look down about boilerplate. But the devil's in the detail, and if you don't look at the boilerplate, you could get into trouble. And that includes you have to be careful of the notice provisions, which we'll see in a minute, and the section headings, A lot of people look for something and they trust the section headings. But are the section headings accurate? If they're not accurate, there's typically no recourse, and as a consequence, you could get a bad result. Now let's look at the term. A lot of agreements say the term is for a year, and it's automatically renewed for 1-year terms unless either party to the agreement notifies the other at least 120 days or whatever period of time prior to the end of the term not to renew it. I don't like this provision. I try to avoid that because this provision puts the onus on the party, on you guys, to keep a tickler system to say that if you don't want to renew this contract for another year or be bound by it for another year, 120 days prior to the end, you have to provide notice. And, so it is a burden. And if you forget to do that, you're stuck. And if you're stuck, you're bound by this contract for another year. And the other part of it is that what is notice? Most contracts in the boilerplate have a notice provision, and sometimes it says notice can only be effectuated if sent by certified mail, or notice is 3 days after being sent by Federal Express, or 20 days after being sent by regular mail. You have to check the notice provisions in the contract. So, for example, if you want to cancel a contract, and you're bound by this first one, you have to give at least 120 days notice prior to the end, and you send something by regular mail on the 121st day, and notice says that if you send it by mail, it has to be 10 days ahead of time, or you have to send it by certified mail, that notice may not be deemed effective under the contract, and even though you thought you gave notice, the contract continues, and it may be something that hurts your client or hurts your organization. So instead of being burdened by this, if you can, the best way to do it is the contract's for 1 year, provided, however, if both parties agree in writing, then the contract gets renewed. So basically there has to be a mutual agreement to renew the contract, and you don't have to worry about a tickler system. It works either way. Some people argue that, you want this to be renewed constantly over time because that way it's more consistent. But if you ever want to bow out of the contract, then you're stuck with this tickler kind of alert system. There's also something called an Evergreen term, and I copy this, and this basically means that the term is automatically renewed every year for 3 years, so that there's always a 3-year period running with respect to the term. So if you want to cancel it, then it doesn't get canceled at the end of the current term. The current term extends for another 2 years, so there's always a 3-year term in the mix, so it automatically renews every year for another 3-year period. A lot of times this was used in employment agreements, where there was the employee wants to have some consistency, knowing that if they want to get out of the contract, apart from reasons for cause, etc., then you have to give me at least 3 years' notice, which gives me enough time to find another job, etc. It has its advantages and disadvantages, but it's something that you have to be alert to. So what happens is, if you're reviewing a contract, you have to understand what the concept of the term is, and whether it's a flat term or an evergreen term, etc. Now, let me just turn back to some of the other provisions that we talked about here. Okay. There was a case, okay, and I'm just going to point this out, okay, to see how careful you have to be in contract review. There is no such thing in contract review, okay, as taking a short circuit. Okay, if you try to cut corners, okay, sometimes you get lucky and it works, and other times it doesn't. As I said, over the course of many years, I've seen material buried under different section headings, okay, that had nothing to do with the section headings. And a lot of contracts have provisions that say the section headings are for convenience purposes only, and it doesn't affect any interpretation of the agreement. And so basically what they're saying is there's no recourse and no liability if I place it in the wrong section. And what happens is that if you're relying on the section headings, that's your headache, and you could have something in the contract that you agree to that's buried in another provision that could be very problematic. There was a case a while ago, okay, it's kind of an interesting case, where there was 50 pages of a formula placed in a contract. The contract was like 200 pages long, and there was like 50 pages of it, that what would happen if they didn't move forward with a specific deal, and all kinds of formulas to calculate the level of damages, etc. And it was like, as I said, 50 pages of all kinds of formulas, etc. In the next to last page of the contract, there was a provision that says the parties agree that, okay, notwithstanding anything contained in this agreement to the contrary, no party shall be liable to the other in the event a specific transaction doesn't happen. So you have 50 pages of contract language that was negated at the end of the contract by one sentence. So obviously there was a dispute as to whether or not damages would happen, and whether or not that provision put at the end under a different section heading was going to be given credibility by the courts. And it was thrown to protracted litigation, because the argument was that it was hidden, it was one sentence, wanted to take out the 50 pages, and the court was sort of relegated to trying to figure out what the intent was between the parties with respect to that. And it went on and on and on, and finally it settled, okay? But when you're dealing with these kind of things, okay, you have to read the entire document from front to back, okay? And sometimes I tell people, if it's a long enough document and it's boring enough, start in the back and work your way forward kind of thing. So you focus and you're more alert on some of the stuff, because some of the juicy stuff is hidden within the boilerplate and other provisions of the agreement. By the time you get to it, like you're blind already, you can't see straight, and you're like, you just want the project to be over with. And that way you can have a little bit more sense as to what's happening there. And a lot of times you always have to wonder if the other side is playing games, if there's an ethical violation, or they simply threw it in the wrong section by mistake. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, you're sort of bound by it once your side signs it, and you have to be very, very careful.